So I feel like there's been kind of like, I suppose, a lot of intrigue, I would say, on the right, maybe kind of about the sort of like content maybe, or the articles that you've been writing lately. And a part of me sort of feels like maybe that intrigue comes from maybe a misunderstanding of Marxism on the right. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, because it's probably not my area of expertise. But I sort of get the sense maybe that right-wingers sort of wrongly understand Marxism as maybe like a policy platform, that like Marxists sort of, they're like, oh, what's the position on immigration? They go through the list and it's like, oh, like import like infinity immigrants or something. Whereas maybe it's like better understood as a sort of theory or like method of historical or political critique. Would you say?
Yeah, you're I think very precisely correct on this. I think much of my fight with the Irish left has been precisely because I take the principles of communism and apply them. These principles are, as you say, not policy platforms. The principle of communism and of Marxism, really, the method, it's a method by which we analyze society and historical developments. So there can be a lot of diverging perspectives. It's essentially a framework, a heuristics framework that you apply to the world, and then you decide how to act, how to build a policy platform. But there is no single set of rules or policies, I think, that a Marxist should subscribe to. And a lot of the left, the issue, the Irish left, is that they're very dogmatic. They're not very open to new ideas. They don't see it as a framework where there could be disagreements on various questions. Rather, I think that much of the Irish left, even those the ones that claim to be Marxist, have essentially subscribed to a liberal ideology, a set of policies, and then they sort of exclude anyone from the left who doesn't agree
with that.
Yeah.
Obviously, I hope you don't mind me saying, but I think your like take on sort of migration into Ireland isn't actually like particularly novel from like a Marxist sense, right? I know that like Marx himself kind of wrote about the impact of Irish immigration into England, and sort of saying how this kind of worked to like break down working class solidarity. Obviously, even in Ireland, like James Connolly, I know, campaigned against Belgian refugees into Ireland, or at least wrote about it. And then I suppose even in the modern context, like we sort of see people like Bernie Sanders with the famous quote, like, it was open borders is like the policy of the Koch brothers. But I feel like it's sort of a bizarre sort of backlash for something that is actually kind of like very consistent with the Marxist tradition in a way.
What I did essentially was conducted a scientific analysis of society, of migration. What you have here in Ireland is you have a center-right government which has completely mismanaged migration policy. It consistently puts asylum seekers and IPAS centers in under-resourced, neglected communities, fueling tensions. And then on the other hand, what you have is you have a so-called Marxist opposition, like People Before Profit or the Socialist Party, and all they do is whenever the working class in areas like City West, most recently, complain about the state of affairs. And again, this state of affairs is one of resourcing concerns. Okay, it's a concern about resourcing, it's a concern about how the government is distributing asylum seekers, about, in City West taking away their most prized hotel in the community. And now whenever the working class complains about this, rightly so, instead of the left opposition so taking on board their concerns, integrating it within a sort of reasonable analysis of how this is affecting the working class, they moralize, they condemn the working class communities as being racists, as being far right, and in this way actually support the government because they don't attack the government policy. Look, no one in this country would be happy with the state's migration policy. No one. And that includes the asylum seekers themselves and the locals. The IPAS system is a broken one. and it is one that neither meets human rights standards, and it is one that I think does great damage to societal cohesion on a local level.
I think it's sort of like a bizarre thing where I suppose having like multiple like very similar sort of like centre-left parties like the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and so on, you sort of like, it might be on the face of things a good strategy in that you sort of, you might like eternally ensure like a centre-left government, right? Because you have to have like coalition with these parties. But then I feel like increasingly it's that these centre-left parties become sort of the mudguard for the government. So in the last election, we were aware that there were like Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael councillors and representatives for the local elections and for the general elections that were going around saying like, this is the crazy Greens, this is the crazy Greens, and like once we get them out, like we'll be back on track. But obviously that doesn't really transpire, right? So the left just become this eternal mudguard, I feel, yes, for the government.
And I would agree with that, because the left in this country is fundamentally so focused on having this sort of liberal arrogance, I think, towards working class communities, have essentially bringing into existence a culture war focusing on these cultural issues, part of which is their moralizing condemnation, by the way, of the working class. They are unable to construct a politics which can actually mobilize people against the government. So what you end up with is the liberals, the liberal left, who proclaim themselves to be in opposition, actually disorganize the working class. Lenin agrees with this, right? Lenin has always said that it is the liberal parties which misdirect and disorganize the class, fracture the class. Instead of focusing on maybe class politics, they would focus on these fractured identities, and based on this, have this very moralizing, condescending attitude towards the working class. And you mentioned open borders, right? That's exactly it, right? Since when did this idea of open borders? It is something that the left, like people before profit, say because it is acceptable to their social base, to university campuses and students. It sounds good, it sounds progressive, but in reality, no genuine communist, if they truly analyzed this idea of open borders, would agree to it. Even a socialist state will have a security control at the borders. It will have borders, it will have people coming in and signing in at these borders. If we're talking about a socialist economy, they would do this so that the state could then assign the workers to different industries. But to have open borders or no borders at all, it is common sense that that's not a implementable policy under a system whatsoever.
Well, I suppose I would agree with you that in the sense that like obviously like from the right perspective, I do think that like the working class are like disproportionately affected by the impact of migration. So I think like even when it comes to like undercutting wages, obviously that happens across the board, but it's particularly pernicious when it comes to sort of lower paid jobs than it is with higher paid jobs. And then I think even in England, like for all the moralising over immigration, and I would argue particularly from the left, when you have things like the grooming gang scandals, like this, like feels like it was disproportionately affecting working class women. So I feel like there is almost like a disregard from this moralistic left towards, I think, the working class, both in Britain and in Ireland.
My position would be to sort of separate some issues. So first of all, I would agree, and no one can deny that there are integration concerns. There has to be proper integration procedures for migrants coming into the country. That is something I absolutely agree with. When it comes to wages, of course, we've seen that what you're saying is partially true. I mean, Bernie Sanders himself, he opposed the H-1B1 visas because he saw it as a way of essentially importing cheap foreign labor, both exploiting the migrant workers themselves and also that would be detrimental to the local workers. But of course, the resource competition here, right, for wages or for housing can in fact be resolved with solidarity between migrant workers and Irish workers. So, for instance, when it comes to housing, I would say the solution is not to, focus too much on the numbers coming in, although that undoubtedly puts pressure on housing and on facilities, and we see this with the IPAS system, but solutions, for instance, like uniting against capitalists, against landowners, requisitioning their property, that would be the communist position, taking over empty housing so that there is enough for everyone. But you see, there is nuance here, because if you put this to someone in People Before Profit, they would undoubtedly call you a racist, as they do with the working class. But the working class have genuine and legitimate concerns which have to be answered with a nuanced response, one that doesn't call them just racists or doesn't engage in this sort of classism, but that actually provides an answer rooted in a material analysis.
Of course, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that to an extent, obviously, but I think maybe an aspect of this so I suppose in Marx's own analysis with the Irish immigrants coming into England, it is that like it basically breaks down sort of any opportunity for like worker solidarity, because English workers were able to see that Irish workers were like undercutting their wages, and I think he makes the argument then that English workers should see that Irish emancipation is in their interest. And I think maybe there's a lesson for that in the right as well, that like when it comes to the Middle East, or when it comes to sort of maybe North Africa, that definitely investment and sort of, I would say there's a brilliant line by Giorgio Meloni, it's like we need to like liberate Africa from like certain Europeans. And I think there's definitely like some common ground there, where it's like, when it comes to immigration, we need to be considering what are the push factors. And I think in many cases that is like Western intervention as well. But at the same time, I think that like the solution there isn't importing those populations into Europe.
Yeah, I mean, that is obviously undoubtedly the core issue, right? Is that what we have seen is, but you know, to be fair, these were oftentimes right-wing governments in power who agreed to Western intervention in the Middle East, in Africa, in a bunch of different places, that has led to essentially the impoverishment of people within those countries, or to war and destruction and destitution in those countries, and they were forced to flee. No one wants to, leave their home countries. It would be best, and this is obviously the standard communist position as well, to let countries develop by themselves, sometimes support them, but obviously never to engage in imperialist wars that destabilize these countries and then lead to subsequent emigration from those countries.
So I suppose I would completely agree with you that the right has been, like I think it's almost like an inversion of it, right? I know, like the kind of like famous, like I suppose in America, the sort of like famous trope would be that like the unions are the real racists or something like that. But I suppose, and then obviously you had Bush that like pushed for like the liberalization of migration laws in America. But then I suppose there's sort of been an inversion now where the left have sort of become the vehicle for mass immigration, or like pro-immigration sentiment, as almost like a moral virtue, whereas the right is kind of deviating from that. But I would also argue that I think the right has actually like moved more towards the left on economic issues. Like if you look at like Le Pen in France, like there's definitely, like I don't think you could argue that she's a right-wing economic force.
And Hungary as well, obviously.
Yeah, 100%.
Like Orban practices protectionist economic policies because obviously the neoliberalization that came in around the 2010s is something that, well, it's that really made a lot of people homeless, a lot of people poor, pushed a lot of people into very difficult situations. And so neoliberalism as an economic policy is, I think, something that must be fought against. But I do think that the sort of the communist or the left-wing objection to some of the rhetoric espoused by the right is along the lines of you're misdirecting a lot of the justified anger towards, let's say, migrants, when we could also, or asylum seekers, refugees, when we could also be focusing on much more radical policies. Right, radical policies such as taking stock of derelict properties, empty properties, trying to, taking these over, nationalizing them, and having them for the people. Because even if you got rid of every migrant in Ireland, you would still have a housing crisis. Now that's not to say that that there aren't real serious issues with how specifically the Irish government is dealing with the influx of migrants. For example, the Ukrainian migrants in 2022, 2023, about 100,000 people. The government definitely gave special privileges to them, first of all, thereby stoking tensions between the Irish people and the Ukrainian refugees. The act of putting IPAS centers into facilities which have been up to this point used by locals, taking away hotels, restaurants, or recreational facilities, and of course that has to be said and that has to be called out, which the right has been doing and has been correctly doing.
I feel like I feel like the right has been very vocal on things like IPAS profiteering, which I think is a major thing. But I do think there is a fundamental difference in I think you can develop a Marxist or left-wing critique of immigration, but I do still think that we are coming at this from very, very different angles. I suppose for me, I think that all of the sort of materialist sort of critiques of migration, whether that's with housing, public utilities, or crime, are completely fair critiques. But then at the same time, I feel we've sort of been I feel people feel uncomfortable maybe criticizing anything beyond maybe the utilitarian, because obviously the sort of racial discourse that we've had over the past God knows how many years has kind of made people maybe uncomfortable about saying that there is sort of maybe an intrinsic value in there being a nation that is Irish. And I suppose maybe the example I kind of always give on this is that I actually kind of have a very strong interest, I would say, in Indian culture and Indian history. I'm just generally a big fan of India, and on top of that, Indians are almost like the model migrant. They tend to actually contribute more than they withdraw from the system. They tend not to commit much crime, but then at the same time, I feel I see that I think it's with the projected rates of inward migration in the next 15 years, Ireland, I think, is set to be 11% Indian. And I don't think I feel a level of, I don't feel any animosity towards Indians for that, but I do kind of feel this sense of loss that definitionally that means that Ireland will be less Irish, I suppose.
I wouldn't say that I feel uncomfortable as a leftist to talk about cultural differences. Without a doubt, there are cultural differences. When migrants come into the country or asylum seekers, that is exactly why I would advocate for integration facilities to learn English, to learn Irish, for them to be able to get a job. Otherwise, and this was actually the most controversial part of my recent article on IPAS centers, was that I did bring up this point, that if you don't have the proper integration procedures, that does lead to antisocial behavior around IPAS centers, and I don't deny this point. And of course that that there is an absolute value in having an Irish national identity, a collective shared sense of identity. I do believe that it can, accommodate people of different countries. But I also know that a lot of the reason why people have a sort of a loss of the shared identity is precisely because of the neoliberalization of society, where we are feeling much more atomized, where our entertainments, places, our pubs, our venues are closing down because of the high rent or government policy. So you also have to account for these factors. But I do acknowledge your point.
I completely agree with you that I do think this sort of neoliberalization has created a much more atomized and sort of isolating and maybe even alienating culture. But then I feel at the same time, I really liked your piece, and I think the others as well. It was a very, I think, comprehensive critique. But I think a part of me feels that, and I think maybe liberals sort of make this argument that sort of that the IPAS Centre is sort of like a proxy for like it's a stand-in or a symbol or a proxy that people are like using to like kind of like when the actual intention is like racism or something like that. But I feel like I do sort of get the sense that the IPAS Centre is almost like a symbol or a proxy for like this sort of existential angst that like an Irish Ireland is actually sort of like slipping through our fingers, and that while people are rightfully aggrieved over the very like direct and tangible impact having an IPAS Centre in their community is going to do to them, that there is also this sort of sense that we're losing something that like we can't very easily repair.
Yeah, I absolutely disagree with the liberals on that. No, I mean, this is exactly why we actually talk to people in City West. We analyzed press releases and articles, and what we had found is actually a much more complex picture, was that people having been neglected by the government, not just, first in the case of the actual purchase of the hotel, which went ahead without any communication, which then also seemingly is the state spending a lot of money on purchasing this hotel, money that is going to a landlord, a capitalist, something that is not going to the community, the act of taking it away. But in addition to that, angers around the already underfunded public services, anger around austerity policies, anger around the liberal elite, whether in academia, NGOs, or the liberal opposition, or the liberal sort of elite, by which we mean the government as well, sort of that liberal elite looking down on the people. That's sort of classism. A lot of different factors contribute to why people are protesting at the IPAS centers. The racism, and there are undoubtedly racist elements there, but I would argue that the racism is mere sort of, it's a secondary aspect of this, where in reality the picture is much more complex. It's a picture of a people who have been forgotten, those with the least purchase in society having been forgotten, looked down upon, who now seek to reclaim some sense of identity, some control over their communities, right? Because not only did these people live through austerity, the working class lived through austerity, and that affected them greatly, it is now also that the government is intervening in their own local communities, the one place where at least they would have thought that they had some sort of stake or ability to influence things. Yeah, I mean, we have, I think, greatly lost, as in our countries, a sort of sense of identity, and that was definitely spurred on by economic factors. And then with the sort of migration question, it now looks like the government is prioritizing. It came to the Ukrainian migrants, prioritizing them instead of the Irish people, spending all this money on the IPAS system instead of the Irish people. So I don't think there's anything wrong with saying the government should also look after its own.
Of course, I would agree with you. I feel like something that's sort of maybe different in Ireland compared to when you look across the continent, maybe when it comes to like sort of anti-migration activism or protests, you kind of like hear terms like racist or fascist. But I think something that maybe separated Ireland from that was actually that you heard, I remember like particularly around the Coolock riots, and actually the Dublin City riots as well, was actually the use of the word scum rather than racist or fascist. So I do actually feel like the backlash against these were less to do with any kind of ideological motive, and it did feel more sort of like a classist reaction.
Yes. Scum, dole merchant.
It's mental.
Doesn't have a leaving cert to his name. All this, but that again comes to show that the people who are saying this, a lot of them are coming from left-wing politics. Or why? I thought we thought left-wing politics was supposed to be working class politics. But it reveals where the left's current social base is. It's in ivory towers. It's in academia, across university campuses. There is so much classism in Irish society where people who are, I know the left, now I'm criticizing my own tribe here, obviously, my own people there, but
rightfully so.
But they wouldn't go down to City West and knock on the doors and say, what's going on, and they wouldn't, uncover the months and months of peaceful protests which had zero racist rhetoric, which didn't even go as far as saying we should, control migration, they wouldn't bother, right? All they see when they look at working class people who are fighting for their community resources is that these people don't have our enlightened view, our theory, and our knowledge that we must bring to them.
Absolutely, and I feel like you yourselves made a really good point in the article as well, that it's sort of like the lexicon as well, that they sort of like weren't really like expressing their grievances about migration in sort of the correct language, which I think was a major part of it as well.
Yes, if you're a leftist, you have a certain like linguistic world, I suppose. You have a way where the way in which you talk, and you have to, we all know this sort of the usual very annoying archetype of the leftist, where you have to couch everything in all sorts of vogue terminology. You use, intersectionality matrices and cis heteronormativity, all that. You can list a lot, but basically the point being is that you have these leftists who, if only they had couched it, who look at what the working class people are saying, but because they use language that might not be politically correct, or that is a little bit more rougher, doesn't abide by this like respectability language, they immediately reject it. If the people there, the workers in the community there, maybe would have
phrase things differently,
then it would have been looked at in a better light by the left.
I would actually agree. Like, I think it's actually a kind of. I guess since it's a similar problem in the Irish right as well, or at least from sections of the Irish right, where there seems to be this like obsession with respectability. But I think that kind of like actually like hurts the overall movement as well, which I think is quite frustrating. But I think from maybe like the left-wing perspective, I feel like Ireland maybe is like lagging behind the rest of the continent. So I feel like the left in Ireland sort of have this opportunity to sort of like put their finger to the wind and be like, okay, well look, this is where the left have failed, like kind of across the board in Europe in a way. And then they can like look at like where the left have been successful in Europe. So I think the two that would come to mind maybe for this example is Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, and then the Danish Social Democrats that have kind of like maybe regrettably put a halt to the rise of the right. And I think it's sort of a bizarre thing to me that like there's sort of no lessons learned there, that they're sort of like going down the sort of trodden path of like irrelevance in a way.
I see the positive elements, for example, in the Wagenknecht part that you mentioned. I think that they go a bit too much to the right to my liking, but there are elements there which could definitely take, and I've obviously expanded on a lot of these, center class first, don't get rid of, but reduce the amount you talk about culture war issues, amongst others. But the left here has no sort of introspection. It doesn't reflect on itself. If people before profit or the Socialist Party have elected their TDs, they have their base, they have members who they're signing up. This base is mostly concentrated in the universities, so they can continue existing within those circles. They don't really have that much of an incentive to suddenly switch their focus to working class areas. They've already, within their organizations, they have bureaucratically solidified this liberal line. This liberal line in turn allows them to get more media attention, to partner up with NGOs, and most crucially to partner up with Labour, Sog Dems, Greens, Sinn Féin and such. So by doing this, they have actually kind of locked in for themselves a system of incentives, and they are staying where they're at.
But I suppose it strikes me maybe that like the system of incentives is kind of like it's great for like sustaining where you're at maybe to an extent, right? But ultimately I think like completely like counterintuitive to like any level of growth. So like I remember I was actually in Dublin. There was so it was around the time before the Dublin riots when the East Wall protests were happening, and there was like a United Against Racism rally, and it was basically just like PBP and all whatever other random left-wing party, and then like a laundry list of NGOs. And I remember I was like walking down the river, and these like two kind of like young lads from the area like were walking by me, and I remember they said something like, "I'll shove the bleeding flag up their hole" or something. So I feel like it's kind of alienating to like the actual working class. And then on top of that, I mean, it's not really like where they're at now is like a particularly like stable or like safe position, right? I think it's like completely understandable or predictable even that like Paul Murphy's seat is like not a particularly safe seat given like everything that's happening in that constituency. Maybe Boyd Barrett's, but that's obviously only because he's in like a very, very liberal seat, right, fundamentally.
It's performative and it's symbolic and it's counterproductive. That's what I thought when I saw the April 2025 counter demonstration. You had 10,000 people marching down of different political views. Sure, you had the National Party there, but most people there were ordinary Irish people, working people. And you have 200 student activists shouting, "You're all Nazis, you're all fascists, you're all racist." And mind you, some of the migrants were amongst the anti-immigration crowd as well, which again comes to show that this movement actually captures a much larger share of dissatisfaction with the Irish government. It's not something that's hyper focused on like actual scientific racism. And so unfortunately this is the ideology or the approach that they have chosen. Yes, it does alienate the working class, and it is very likely that people before profit will eventually lose all their seats, will eventually, they're on a downhill route right now. Part of this is because they have no policies. Again, they are mostly an activist group rather than a political party. So that's what they view themselves as well. So they sort of attach themselves to different social movements. Once that social movement is no longer pure, let's say, or pure leftist in the way that they wanted, they abandon that movement. So you go back to East Wall. East Wall says no. Originally, and Kieran Perry talks about this, and Joe Mooney from Lesser.org, is that the sort of like anti-IPAS protests there were a basic community initiative. It was common sense to everyone that IPAS center should not be there because there's not enough resources in this area. And eventually, PBP came down, and all they could offer was not analysis, no solutions, standing on the sidelines, shouting, down with the racist scum out. So it's a very counterproductive politics, and they have no policies, because when you ask them, what about migration, they say open borders. But what does that mean? How will you actually manage the migration system?
I definitely take that point, but I feel like, I suppose you mentioned László Molnárfi and Kieran Perry. I always find it very strange that like it does seem to be almost like groups like PBP that seems to have been more successful, whereas I suppose László Molnárfi, or I think I mentioned to you before, the Workers' Party, haven't really seen as much electoral success, which sort of is a strange thing to me, given that I feel like they seem to be much more in touch or much more sort of respond better to like the concerns of like their constituencies than maybe PBP do,
yes.
which seems more performative in a way, I think.
But the difference is that while those groups are socialist Republican groups, which I suppose have a Marxist framework of analysis, PBP more vibes based. It more sort of pretends to be a radical socialist party, but in reality adopts a lot of liberal positions. And these liberal positions, I think, really help them get into the mainstream. It helps them get into the universities, establish a network with NGOs and with the media. So they're a more respectable voice for some parts of the of the population or of the political elite that we have in this country. You know, some people say controlled opposition because they disorganize genuine working class movement.
Can I ask, I was talking to sort of a feminist recently that was, that would be anti-migration, and I was sort of like saying, we were like talking about like why maybe more mainstream feminists kind of had like a hesitancy to speak about like the impact of that mass migration is having on women. And she sort of said that she was actually like sympathetic to their position because ultimately she felt that there were like many parts of feminism that were very, very good, and she had this sort of concern that, and she would understand their concern that if they deviated on migration, basically they would be shut out of the conversation, so they wouldn't be able to advance these other aspects of feminism. And would you feel the same way about leftism in a way that like basically even though the migration issue disproportionately affects the working class, that ultimately by talking about it you're kind of like shutting yourself off from like advancing other areas of like left-wing politics?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Irish left is very dogmatic. My articles, or well, actually before the article, I was kicked out of a left-wing group called the Red Network for merely stating the simple fact that the placement of IPAS centers is less than ideal, and that I lent my support to those elements of the working class who were protesting in City West, not rioting, but just protesting, and so there is a sense that this sort of like virtue signaling has risen above pragmatic politics, has risen above, sort of has become more important in the left than actually winning power. Yes, so basically I do feel like I am being kicked out of the Irish left merely for it's not even, I don't represent controlled migration. I am merely for a reform of the migration system, right? And so, even for this, they don't accept my views or my opinions. They even call Sinn Féin racist, even for wanting to reform the system.
But I think the sort of surprising thing, like particularly about like the Red Network, was that it was kind of like from memory it was sort of like set up in sort of opposition to this sort of like moralizing as well. But which I suppose
pulled back. They got pulled back into it because it is fundamentally hard to step out of. It's one circle. It's the left-wing circle, which PBP have kind of captured, and groups like the Socialist Party, right? So they've kind of like captured the general cultural discourse around what leftism is. I think they were pulled back, and I think that they were maybe afraid to take that step of actually going out and reorienting themselves to these communities.
But see, I think the thing that like is, I suppose, most shocking to me is that I don't really understand why they can't like kind of like put their finger to the like I get maybe that like if you're PBP that you have this sort of like network of NGOs, you're like you can like go on the media whenever you want. But I suppose if you're like particularly a group like Red, I think it's bad for PBP in the long run. But then I suppose like with groups like with the Red Network, like this really feels like an open goal in a way, and it's sort of bizarre to me that they can't like see what's happened to like. Literally, like with very few exceptions, almost every left-wing party across the continent, and that they can't imagine that this is just going to happen to them as well. Like,
I think it goes back to what you asked me at the very start, which is that some of these groups like to use Marxism as a dogma, or the idea of communism as a dogma, and so they have a need to essentialize certain social movements. So when they look at something like the anti-immigration movement, they have this drive to say these people are fascists or lumpen proletariat or whatever other terminologies they come up with, because they take the words of Lenin and that of Marx and this entire sort of theory of communism and communist writings as very solid, fixed, dogmatic thing, not as something that guides us to action, right? Me as a communist, I want a planned economy, right? It's essentially a reorganization of the economic system away from capitalism to something that is planned collectively by the people. And how you get there and what politics you use can very much differ. And in this case, I say let's actually analyze why these people are protesting and try to talk to them and capture their energies towards a movement, a socialist left-wing movement. They didn't see it that way. They said, let's reject them outright.
Yeah, and obviously, again, I'm sure you know far more about this than I do, but like it almost feels like less of like sort of maybe a dogmatic approach to Marxism as much as it does maybe a sort of abandonment of that sort of tradition in a way, right? Because I mean, obviously, if you want to like pull on like sort of like Marxist theory for like a critique of immigration, I mean, you've like no shortage of like stuff to touch on, right? But I feel like they've kind of like abandoned that sort of analysis for sort of like a moralizing effectively.
Yes. James Connolly has an article because so it's an interesting one because James Connolly, when he was criticizing migration, so I don't evade your question because you did bring up James Connolly earlier, so I don't want to evade it. I'll answer it like as I see it. You know, he had writings where he quite correctly pointed out, for instance, that in the case of the Irish working class, if an English or Scottish jingoist, that is a unionist, you know, a nationalist from those countries, come in to Ireland to work, that he opposes that. He wrote this quite controversial article. Patriot. Yeah, but so in that case, you know, he sort of adapted his analysis to the circumstances at hand, right? He didn't say all migrants are good, always good. He was quite
more selective,
yeah. So obviously more selective. So that is when I say as well that if you that it's not good that the government, that the way the government has been handling migration. It is not good that Ukrainians are being seen as being given special privileges within this system. This is all very, very negative, right? From my perspective, this is something that we should call out. I wouldn't hold a right-wing position on like let's control migration, right?
But surely fundamentally when you like say things like there are integration problems, right? Like surely that is downstream from the scale of immigration to the country, right?
For instance, in the case of the influx of Ukrainian migrants, you know, which, you know, it is not an easy thing to deal with, integration, especially when you have many people coming in. But I mean, I do believe that eventually, if you have proper integration policies in place and a good economic model, then you can actually integrate migrants into the workforce, because that's very important, right? Under a capitalist economy, you might struggle with integrating newcomers into a workforce. Under a socialist planned economy, not so much.
Well, I think it's like I suppose like even if there is like, well, we have our socialist revolution and all that. I suppose the system that we're working in at the moment is the capitalist economy. Although you'd wonder, but I think the problem is surely the scale, right? Like even if you have like if you have like a very large number of a particular ethnic group coming in, it's kind of difficult to like dissolve them into the general population.
Yes, well, as that was seen in 2016 with the migration crisis. Like it is not something. Let me state it in this way: the influx of many hundreds of thousands of people is not something that is desirable. Let's say it's not something that is. It's something that's very hard to deal with from a country-to-country basis, and the European Union completely failed at dealing with it. Its quota system failed, its integration was left up to individual countries. This led to so much tension. Under a system such as under a system of communism, I suppose, there wouldn't have been the need for so many people to emigrate and make that perilous journey from the Middle East, from Africa to Europe in the first place. So it's not something that I would say that I'm for controlled migration or that I oppose, close the borders. No, I wouldn't say that, because that is fundamentally distracting from some issues, some more pressing issues, such as property relations, who owns the housing in this country, who owns the companies, factories, etc., etc. So politics is also a matter of emphasis, right? So I would emphasize that.
But surely we've had like migration from communist countries in Africa and Eastern Europe and beyond into Europe as well, right?
Yeah, not real communism.
Okay, but I suppose like in the situation where I think the part that like I suppose the like back to like Marx's original point that I sort of like respect about like the left-wing critique is that I maybe actually a critique of many right-wingers is that we shouldn't care about like what's happening in the rest of the world, right? Because it's not our fight, it's not our problem kind of thing. They can sort their own problems out. But the reality is that like ultimately if we want to like get a grip on migration, that a very significant part of that is going to be stemming the source of migration where it's happening, right? Whether that's North Africa or the Middle East. And I suppose a right-wing kind of solution to this that I was very happy about was the Mattei plan from Italy. And I suppose for that reason I was sort of maybe a little bit frustrated, I think, with certain factions on the right that were very much in favor of the war in Gaza, because I feel like, so in the case of Italy, like they were pushing ahead with the Mattei plan only for North African countries to pull out of that deal because of the stance that Italy was taking on Israel at the time. And I suppose from like a very sort of realist perspective as Europeans, that kind of didn't really make sense to me, I suppose.
But I mean, it has been a sort of traditional, it is the usual politics of right-wing leaders when they get into power to align themselves with American or EU, British imperialism and conduct regime change operations around the world.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, I think definitely there's like an Atlanticist right, and I think that particularly in Western Europe, that's a very, very strong contingent of the right. But I think if you look at like Hungary as kind of like the ideal that like you kind of can see that you can sort of break away from this sort of bloc-based approach to foreign policy, and I don't think it's like would be particularly surprising to me if say the FPO in Austria or the AfD in Germany sort of like pursued that same sort of route, which it seems to be what they're hinting at.
And Hungary, opposes NATO in some areas, such as with the war between Ukraine and Russia, but it certainly supports Israel, and it certainly supports, Israel's sort of desire to expand and attack its neighboring countries and expand into also the occupied territories with settlements and such. So I would say that they haven't fully broken away from that sort of Atlanticist thinking.
But I suppose this would sort of be maybe my critique, just maybe the like obviously like as you know like I'm I suppose very like sympathetic to I would say not all, but certainly some of your like critiques about the situation in Gaza. But at the same time, I would say that I think much like when you say like, oh, that wasn't real communism, I suppose you can't really like kind of build a castle in the sky, right? That you're sort of like restrained by the geopolitical context that you're in. And ultimately, I feel that whether Ireland or whether Hungary takes a radical position on the Palestinian issue, like in the grander scheme of things, doesn't mean anything. And I get the idea that you should like bear witness and kind of like object to like moral atrocities. But at the same time, I feel like particularly in Ireland, the reality is that the consequence of taking these positions is going to be borne out in the Irish people. And you've seen sort of the efflorescence of like articles, I'm sure. You have like, what was it, in like America, you have like the most anti-Semitic country in Europe, and in England, like the woke island or whatever.
But I mean, if you're, let's say, an Irish nationalist, much like if you are a communist, you want, one of your goals, your aims has to be that Ireland is a sovereign country in which it is the Irish people, the people living here, who themselves decide on the direction that the country is taking, whether that be in domestic or foreign policy. So I think that even at the cost, a great political or economic cost to Ireland, our activists, let's say from my side, left-wing activists or even nationalist activists, should pursue a policy of sovereignty in order to try to reduce the influence of three things. It is the European Union's imperialism, right? And let us say that it is also the European Union which has decreed austerity from Brussels, right? That liberal elite from Brussels who decreed austerity on what should be a sovereign nation, Ireland. It is the EU which is pushing hate speech legislation that targets the working class, and our government nods along. And it is the European Union is also pushing, Zionist politics in Ireland. So first, the imperialism of the European Union, then that of the United States and its influence, and then the influence of the British who are still occupying 6 counties in Ireland. So it's a duty of us to speak up for sovereignty.
Well, I would say that, this was the goal is that Ireland is sufficiently influential that we would be able to be like a moral voice in the world stage. But it feels to me that like sort of left-wing politics has like kind of hollowed out the country in a way that we're not able to be like economically or geopolitically competitive. So a consequence of that is that we're not like, you're basically asking Ireland, who's kind of like at the bottom of its game, to compete with Israel, which realistically is at the top of its game. Like it's, in fairness, has like performed phenomenally for various reasons. And I feel like we're just simply not in a position to do that. And then when the backlash comes, then it's just the country that suffers, and we have no real way of like sort of mitigating the effects of that.
But if you look at history and you look at political revolutionaries in history, and we don't even have to go as far as to say, socialist revolutionaries. Let's look at a sort of national liberation. We do see that a country, if it has the right leadership, But
this is the problem. We don't have the right leadership. Yes. And I think that like for this policy to be effective, for us to be actually a moral voice, you kind of have to expect a level of like dexterity in foreign policy that I just simply do not believe that our political class is capable of.
Yeah, but that's it. We want to topple our political class. We want to have a political movement in Ireland that restores our sovereignty and democratic principles from bottom to the top. That's socialist politics, right? And we see that with such politics, if we do have the right leadership, then a country can grow very, very quickly. Look at Maoist China, look at the Soviet Union's early years, when it industrialized. Look at Singapore, if you want to look at a non-socialist example.
Yes, yeah.
Right? So I think this whole idea of, Ireland is so little, we can't do anything, we have to abide by all of these bigger powers. I think that's wrong. I don't think that we should be little.
I agree with you that I think that I do believe you're dead right, that like I do believe Ireland would be much more capable, much more dexterous sort of approach to foreign policy. But I think the problem is that the sort of will or the ambition isn't there at the moment. And obviously the government have been sort of responding, I think, to quite a successful, a very impressively successful Gaza movement. And I think there's a lot of critique that could be leveled at Israel for like how they've sort of responded, like who I believe have escalated the diplomatic dispute far more than the Irish government have. But ultimately, I think that now the state is in a position where we're probably going to receive retaliation, and that we simply don't have the people in a position where we can sort of react to that appropriately.
So you mean that the loss of jobs that will happen because of our dependence on the US, or
not really the loss of jobs. I think that's less. Well, it's not really. It's kind of connected, right? So, like, if we have a loss of foreign direct investment, I mean, ultimately, it's like American capitalism that funds Irish socialism, right? So, and also the tax receipts from the people that like work from those companies. So, if they withdraw from Ireland, then realistically, it's the Irish working class that are going to suffer the most, because ultimately they're missing out on the sort of social investment, the investment from the government into things that benefit us all, but like I think disproportionately those that are the most underprivileged.
Mm-hmm. But I'd say let the Irish working class decide, put them in power, put them into the seat of power. The representative liberal democracy is a talking shop. It's completely dysfunctional. It is not something that represents the wishes of the people. So I would say, let us not defend the government. Let us advocate for a change of the democratic system here in Ireland. And look, we have a very strong tradition here of standing up to bigger powers. We have an anti-imperialist tradition, fighting the British and their allies. And during the course of that tradition, we expressed our solidarity with other similar such struggles happening around the world.
100%. But I think my sort of maybe criticism of like your position is that I think you're putting maybe the cart before the horse in a way, right? That if we want to, which I believe the Irish should be doing, that we should be a moral voice in the world. But my concern is that basically we don't have the sort of competency in power at the moment. They will be able to sort of navigate a more coarse geopolitical situation, which is what we're in. And I agree with you that the Irish democracy is very, very dysfunctional. But at the end of the day, like that's just the situation we're in.
Yes, so you don't see a political force at the moment.
I think even if it was ideologically not in agreement with me, I would feel much more comfortable if I felt that we had the competency there. I suppose my big concern is that I don't feel that we have the competency there to like navigate the situation that we're in at the moment.
Well, I mean, look at from my perspective, I understand what you're saying. Look, from your perspective, you see the right wing as being fractured, probably as not being able to offer leadership. From my perspective, I see a very similar thing on the left, is that who realistically has that sort of authority, right? That sort of ability to govern. That wouldn't be PPP or the Socialist Party, right? They don't.
Suck dams.
Who is it? No. I mean, and of course, when Sinn Féin get into power, they are also very likely to drift towards, as they've been drifting for a bit now, drift towards a more friendly relation with bodies such as the European Union or the United States. So who will lead the people, or what political forces are there in Ireland?
But I don't think it's even like necessarily like about leading the people. Like ultimately, like you want competency there, right? I mean, for whatever can be said about Israel, it's an exceptionally competent state, and the United States is the same. But I suppose my concern is just competency largely. That I don't think that if we want to take very moralistic positions, we need to be able to back that up with competency.
I believe that we can have. We just need to keep fighting, and I'll keep fighting on the left to change its ideological direction. But to keep fighting, keep building our movements, and eventually there will emerge a sort of vanguard, right, of that sort of pro-sovereignty socialist movement, which can not, from my perspective,
coalition. I suppose I'm being stared daggers at to end the discussion. But I suppose as a Danish-style social democrat and a Marxist, have we achieved left unity?